The reality of London is not the reality of the world. The reality of Europe is not the reality of the world. The reality of North America is not the reality of the world, right? Fossil fuel dependency, structural racism, an economic system that's unjust, nuclear weapons, all of these things came from the North, right? Came from the UK and Europe and so on. Why do you think solutions are going to come out of the very same places that created problems?
You're listening to Climate Curious, a podcast for people who care about the world but find the current conversation about climate change confusing, boring, or scary.
My name is Maryam Pasha, and I'm the director and curator at TEDxLondon and co-host of this podcast, along with the amazing Ben Hurst. Say hello, Ben.
Hey there, friends. I'm Ben Hurst, activist and advocate exploring what positive masculinities can look like, humble model, and climate normie.
I think this episode is going to knock your socks off, Ben.
Me?
Now, yeah, you.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if you know this about me, but I started out my career working in human rights.
Right.
And I always felt like you had to choose, right? Like you had to choose whether you cared about human rights or whether you cared about the planet. Like you couldn't do both.
Right.
And I've only really... Hang on, sorry. Really loud train. I used to think that you had to choose. Like, you had to choose human rights and caring about people, or you could choose climate change and caring about the planet. Mm-hmm. And it's only really, I guess, in the last year or two that I've come to realize how that's not true. Do you think you felt that way?
Yeah, I feel like maybe until we started having these conversations, climate change was just never something that was on my agenda. Do you know what I mean? I feel like it kind of gets left out of the conversations, especially conversations around helping people. I feel like we maybe see them as two very different things.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we've done a lot of episodes here where we've kind of started to explore those intersections and crossovers. Right. But I think this episode, and because of the guest we have, is going to be the thing that really, really solidifies it. At least that's how I feel it's going to do what it's going to do for me.
Right. Who have we got?
Well, I'm going to tell you that this person has I'm borrowing a phrase from you, Ben.
Right.
I'm going to say that this person has main character energy.
Big main character energy.
Big main character energy. So Kumi Naidoo was the International Executive Director of Greenpeace for 6 years from 2009 and was the Secretary General of Amnesty International from 2018 to 2020. And actually, he's now, for the last 2 years, been the Global Ambassador for Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity. And that is a lot. There's a lot of big names there.
Yo, that is a lot. There is a lot of big names there. You're not lying.
No, and Kumi started, and I think he's gonna, I know he's gonna tell us about this. He started his activist life as a teenager in South Africa, fighting against apartheid, and so I just think let's not waste any more time. Let's just jump right in.
Yeah, let's dive into it.
Welcome, Kumi. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
There are so many things I could ask you, and I have to say that I'm pretty ecstatic and excited about this conversation, so you're going to have to excuse me if I get a bit too overly excited, Ben, as we go.
Okay.
Don't worry.
But I wanted to ask you a little bit about the state of the world, because I actually was talking to a friend of mine yesterday, and she said for the first time in a long time, her and her dad don't talk about politics because it's just so difficult. Not because they disagree, but because it's so overwhelming. And I wanted to ask you, from kind of everything that you've seen and all the things that you're involved in, I'd love to find out from you where you feel the state of the world is today.
Well, I could put it in a eloquent Afrikaans sentence, which simply says, "Ons is deep in the kak," right? I think most of your listeners will be able to translate that.
Right.
But we are in deep shit, right? The decade that we find ourselves in, I believe, is probably the most consequential decade in humanity's history. What we do in the next 9-10 years will determine what future we have, or whether we have a future at all. And we have a massive level of cognitive dissonance which is the denial of reality by those with power, both to address the threat of climate catastrophe on the one hand, and to address the systemic injustices that people face either as a result of race, gender, economic class, and so on. So what we also see, of course, is high levels of polarization, right? And one of the challenges, I believe, for activism at this time is to figure out how, in this context where we are running out of time, can we imagine a different way of pushing for change, given that a lot of the conventional ways that we've been pushing for change for a very long time is not delivering the results that we need. It's not to say that everything that we do is bad, but, you know, as Einstein once said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results. Now, may I put up my hand and say, I meet that definition of insanity. If I look at my life, you know, people talk about it sometimes in a very positive way. Oh, he's been involved in the struggle for 40 plus years. He's been faithful. He's been pushing, blah, blah, blah. So when people invite me and say, oh, very honored and pleased, and as you said, Maryam, excited and so on, I'm saying, why the hell are you excited? My life is a life of failure, if I'm brutally honest. And what we need is a courage of people and institutions to say, we are failing to turn this ship around. That humanity is on a suicidal trajectory, and there's no time for niceties, there's no time for egos, there's no time for being too polite about how deep a crisis that we are in. So that's my cheery answer to how I feel about the state
Wonderful.
of the world.
Starting with a bang. Okay.
It's always nice.
I want to ask you, because you mentioned this 45 years of work, and, you know, obviously we're giving people a little bit of sense of what you've done, but I wonder if you can give us what stands out for you in terms of what you've done over that period that informs the kind of way that you see the world right now.
I think that the struggle against apartheid, and starting as a 15-year-old in apartheid South Africa, and what I learned in the first sort of 10 years of my activism, if you want, was probably the most instructive, right? And I wish I had hung on to some of the core lessons even stronger than I did. I did, but I got contaminated a little bit along the way by the idea of, you know, doing things where you had big logos and marketing and communications and all of that stuff, right? I want to be honest, right? You know, when I started as a 15-year-old, you had an intuitive sense of injustice, and you saw that, you know, for example, I always tell the story about when I was at the front of the march in 1980 as a 15-year-old fighting against inequality in education. Our slogan was, "We want equality." By the time the slogan got to the back of the march, the younger kids were chanting, "We want a color TV."
Which is also important.
Well, exactly. At that time, then I probably wanted equality and color TV almost equally.
Right, yeah.
Right? And just to say, there is a political message behind the color TV, because kids in white schools had color TVs and kids in black schools had no TVs.
Right. So it wasn't a misfire. That was also an accurate statement, but not necessarily the most pressing issue at the time.
It was a bit of a misfire, but but it still fitted, if you know what I mean. So the important thing is, I think the main lesson I learned is the power of the ideological state apparatus, right? I think one of the mistakes we make in activism is often we think that governments and corporations control us mainly through the use of the repressive state apparatus, by which you can include army, police, formal laws, rules and regulations, and so on. Now, of course, those repressive state tools offer massive control for the state. They define the space for politics and so on. But in reality, actually the repressive state, the ideological state apparatus is that which is the most powerful in maintaining control. What do I mean by the ideological state apparatus? The framework for education, framework for religion, social norms and customs, and critically and most importantly, the framework for education, for media and communications. And so if I say to you, Maryam, the one lesson that stands powerful for me from that earlier period is that politics does not lead culture. Culture leads politics. And I'm sad to say that actually Steve Bannon and before him Karl Rove, the two right-wing ideological leaders of the strategists of the Republican Party, understood that much better than most progressives ever do, right? So that's why they were able to do micro-targeting, figure out certain cultural impulses and completely distort and contort it to get people to shift away from a semblance of decency to a position of hatred and vilification of others and so on. So I think a key problem for us moving forward is how do we get the truth out to the largest number of people in the shortest space of time that changes their attitudes quickly so that they can change their behaviors quickly, both in terms of what they do, in terms of the carbon footprint they leave, more importantly, in terms of how they use their power to resist the suicidal trajectory that humanity is on at the moment with regard to climate catastrophe.
This is it's not something you hear often because I think we're so focused on the politics, right? We're so focused on the policy. The idea that culture is what drives the changes that we want. I guess I'm curious to know whether you think there are any examples of how maybe we have gotten it right, like whether, you know what I mean? Like, I agree. I think obviously Steve Bannon, Karl Rove, that whole group of individuals was able to weaponize that culture and identity. Do you see any examples of it being done effectively in the other way? And do we want to do it effectively the other way? Because it feels like then are we fighting a war of culture, and does that feel uncomfortable?
Well, it depends how we define culture, obviously, right? And I'm using culture here with a small c that includes just the way people are in the world. You know, music, dance, song, how they interact with each other, all of that. And I think we have not got it right. But I think what I'm very positive about is that there are more progressive people around the world who are saying, like I have been saying for the last 5 years, we have to begin to humble ourselves, understand where people are, and not as activists and leaders in big organizations, preach down to people always and saying, we are the holders of absolute truth and you must just listen to us. Because I learned a wisdom from Asia when I was a very young activist here in South Africa I think I was 18, which said, go to the people, live with them, learn from them. Start with what they know, build on what they understand so that when the struggle is won, the people should say they've done it themselves. And that's the challenge right now of activism, of whether in fact we can bring the worlds of arts and culture and the world of activism closer together. Now, I just want to be clear. I'm not talking about, as some activists would say, yeah, we need to get arts and culture to serve resistance. That's not what I'm talking about. And that sort of instrumentalization is not what we need. In fact, if anything, we need arts and culture to hold up a mirror to the failings of activism as well, right? Mm-hmm. As much as it helps activism. So, and there's a word now for it, by the way, artivism.
What?
Artivism, right? So, wait, not for the pandemic. I was about to get ready to go to Berlin for 6 months to spend 30% of my time working with an amazing artist called Olafur Eliasson, on how do we bring these two worlds together, right? Because I think what I am seeing, you see, if I look at South Africa, and there's a lesson to be learned here, right, on this question. I mean, when we were fighting the apartheid regime, one of the biggest things we had to deal with was that the founder of apartheid understood this problem better than most people even today do. right? Because what he said was, blacks should never be shown the greener pastures of education. They should know that the station in life is to be hewers of wood and carriers of water, right? And so depriving people of education was a central part, right? So when we were fighting the apartheid regime, we couldn't go and talk big language and theories and democratization and blah, blah, blah. We had to understand where people were. Like in my youthful activism, one of the most popular slogans that I heard was just something that said Asina Mali. Asina Mali meaning we don't have money, right? We just don't have money. And you know, you could write a whole sort of lefty sort of theoretical stuff about class and structural racism and capitalist exploitation and so on, which we did. Okay, we did that. But actually what gave us the victory in the struggle was always saying, well, how do we take these messages and present them in a way that people can engage with it? And so if people couldn't go and stand on stages and give long speeches and read complicated documents, we said, let's connect with the culture, arts and culture, song, dance. In fact, I remember speaking, I fled South Africa to Britain at the age of 22. I remember speaking at a mass meeting at Reading University of all places. And you know, Oscar Wilde said people only went to Reading for one reason, and that was to change trains for London.
Right.
By the way,
we love you, Reading. We love you.
No. The reason he said that, by the way, was he was put in prison in Reading for his sexual orientation, I believe. And anyway, so speaking there, I got asked a question about why is it you people in South Africa dance and sing at funerals? I mean, that's crazy. We see because in the 1980s, what people around the world saw was South Africans every other weekend burying our leaders or activists that had been killed, right? And so this, you know, somebody, it was a reasonably well-meaning thing. The person said, how can you be singing and dancing at funerals? And then I said, well, actually, I never thought about that, but there was some simple reasons. One, we were saying to ourselves that the regime can do what they want, but they're never going to kill our spirit. We need to tell them our spirit is alive and well at any given time. And I think that's one of the things that I worry about right now. The climate realities have actually ended up sending a message to lots of people that it's probably too late. And you rather turn inward and think about your own families. I mean, and we have to, the other reason we sang and danced was we wanted to say to the families who lost loved ones, you have a right to celebrate the person that's just died and been murdered by the regime. That person is a hero, has lived with dignity and died with dignity. And the other thing was, it also helped us build a sense of camaraderie and unity amongst ourselves. So I have no doubt in my mind, and this is something that I would say very strongly, we will never avert catastrophic climate change or address systemic racism or address the appalling level of economic inequality that exists in the world if activism does not humble itself, listen to where people are, connect to people's cultural realities, and build from what they know and where they are, and recognize also that people have power. That's another problem with activism, by the way, and climate activism in particular. And that is, we always start with people are disempowered, marginalized, excluded, suffering, beaten up, all of which is true and all of which we have to take seriously. But in a way, power wants us to do that. Those with power want us to do that. They want us to focus on all the stuff that they've done to make things difficult for us.
Yeah, and how disempowered we are, right?
Exactly. So we need to flip that. We need to flip that, and we need to start with what power do people actually have to make a difference? And to understand all the different elements of that power so that it can be maximized and harnessed to give us a chance, and I'm choosing my words very carefully here, to give us a chance to avert catastrophic climate change. Because let's be blunt about it. We cannot also be idiotic and not look at what the science is saying. And let me be blunt about it here, that even activist organizations, most of us, are in denial about how close to the climate cliff we are, because it's too difficult. It's too difficult to accept that we are 1 minute before midnight, right? And so, given that reality, we have to also prosecute what we do with a sense of what are the capabilities people have. And this is what I say when young people say, Kumi, do you think we left it too late? And did your generation really screw up and fuck up and leave us in this mess? Then, sorry, this is not BBC, so maybe you don't.
It's not.
Definitely not the BBC. Go for it.
So, you know, and then that accusation is, you know, and then they say, given that your generation has failed, let's be honest, right? It's too late. And my answer to that question is, it might be that we're too late, but I want to believe that we have a very small window of opportunity that is still open, and it's fast closing, right? And we have a moral responsibility to do everything within our power to make the possibility of averting catastrophic, irreversible, runaway climate change. And those words are important. This is what the science talks about, right? And in that sense, I want to say to people, I want to believe that the opportunity is still there for us to save the majority of people on the planet. There's no question in my mind. We are going to lose people in the hundreds of thousands over the next coming years. It's happening already, by the way, right? And the last thing I would say is, if we're going to go down, and if, you know, we're going to lose completely, then we must go down with a fight and hold those who brought us to this point of catastrophe to account. And they would be the people who up to now have occupied very respectable positions in government, in business, and so on. And they will, and so that's what I say to young people, you know, listen, even if you come to a conclusion that it's too late, let's not go down without a fight. But what we need to say is that the window of opportunity is small and closing, but it's still there, and we have to move fast.
Okay, so I've got two questions. I guess one is a clarification, because I think you've spoken about this being the most consequential decade, right? That this coming decade being the most important period of time. And I think the way that you speak sounds like everything is very urgent, and the reality also is that everything is very urgent. So I think there's a piece of the puzzle missing for me with the activism thing, because it sounds like, or maybe clarify this for me. Is it that you believe that is the most impactful way of reaching the most people in the shortest amount of time, and that's why that's something that you would be willing to spend 30% of your time on? Because to me, I don't like, I think that it's almost contradictory, right? Like this message of like, the best way to do this is to like live with the people and listen to them and learn with them. And so when the change happens, they feel like they did it themselves. But that is not a time sensitive method, right? Like that takes a long time. So I'd love you to like clarify that a little bit. And then the other thing I wanted to ask, just hold
it a bit. Let me take that one first, if that's okay.
Okay, no, go for it.
Firstly, let me just say that's an excellent question. Excellent question. And I think what I'm talking about here is accelerated change strategies, right? And what I'm saying is, like, for example, one of the things that I've advocated unsuccessfully when I was head of Greenpeace and Amnesty and other things, unfortunately, it's got movement, but it's not got the kind of movement that it needs. Because I'm totally convinced, right, that if we continue the current change strategies, we're on a road to nowhere, right? Or we're on a road to disaster. For example, I would say, the only thing I can see that will get us to be aligned with the science is rather than campaigning against tens of thousands companies and businesses that are behaving badly and taking us closer to the cliff of climate destruction. It's not only me, but others have been advocating that let's follow the money, right? Let's look at those institutions that are funding these organizations to do these economically destructive activities, and let's shut the flow of capital at source, right? Because like say when I was at Greenpeace, we would go after 5 or 6 companies, say in Indonesia, that was destroying the Indonesian rainforest. And we would, and during the time that I was there, in the end, we were successful to get a moratorium and all of that, right? But that work took decades. It started, it took at least a decade, but it's not a quick win. So in Brazil, for example, when there was a company going to build a dam and a indigenous community reached out to Greenpeace Brazil, and we partnered with the community and we actually followed the money, right? Right? And because quite often the company building the dam, for example, is probably called, X, Y, and Z engineering company, which nobody has heard of and doesn't have any market exposure.
Right.
But if you follow the money, you'll find a Santander there, a NatWest there, and so on, right? And then you can, so basically, one of the things we need to do is recognize we have power because we have bank accounts, right? If we all start saying to our banks, we do not want you to fund any single project that either supports the death and destruction of our children's future, racism, destruction of indigenous people's lives, or human rights violations. And if we push that, right? And by the way, this is not pie in the sky. I'll give you an example. Australia, 2015. The Australian government there was wanting to build the biggest coal mine, one of the biggest coal mines in the history of the world and the largest by far in Australia, in Queensland. And the different activist communities there got together and they went after the 4 banks, the 4 major banks, and they got every bank to say, no, we will not fund it. And then it delayed the project substantially. And unfortunately, the government can also put money into projects like this and the State Bank of India and blah, blah, blah. So it's still moving, but we slowed it down and there's a good chance we can still stop it because now, what we've been saying for decades, that coal kills, is now understood by much larger numbers of people in the world. So that contradiction that you're saying is so I'm saying the way we accelerate things is by going after the right targets, but then we say we're going after banks, right? If we're saying we're going after banks, right, then let's do it in a way that is accessible, that people can understand, and you use stories and images. Let me give you a quick example, sorry. In 2012, I found myself on an inflatable boat on a way to an oil rig in the Greenland to occupy a Norwegian oil rig, right?
How do you find yourself in that kind of situation? But carry on.
Yeah, I was the head of Greenpeace, but I was doing this action as any other volunteer. And this was after 20 activists had been arrested and held in Greenland for 2 weeks before they were deported and so on. And so I'm like on this inflatable boat. You can check it. It's on YouTube. You say Kumi Naidoo Greenpeace Greenland. You'll see me bumbling on a boat, right? And you can see I am shit scared. Right?
You don't want to be there.
You can see I'm scared out of my wits because I can't swim properly, right?
Right.
And so my colleagues then say to me, don't worry, Kumi, the 3 of us on this little boat say, don't worry, Kumi, if you fall in the water, we'll fish you out in time. I said, well,
right.
They said, because, in that water, you fall with normal bathing gear, you'll be dead in a couple of minutes because of hypothermia.
Oh.
But they said, no, the suit you got and all, you'll survive easily 2 hours. I looked at the size of the waves and I thought, might take them 2 hours to find me. These waves
right,
look so
exactly.
big. And then I had this thought, my God, if I kicked it here today, if this was the last action I took in my life for justice, 99.99% of the people I love back home in Africa, my friends, my colleagues, my comrades, they wouldn't know what the hell that sign meant. Because the sign said, this was, now more people understand that the Arctic is one of the front lines of the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change. In 2012, it wasn't like that, right? And this action was partly to explode the thing. And it simply said, stop Arctic destruction, right?
People be like, okay.
So like my brother, so it's cut a long story short, we do the action, I end up in prison, and while I'm in prison, my brother and you know, various comrades start a campaign for my release and so on. So my brother goes on television and they ask him, so what, and my brother is a former political prisoner and so on. And says, so Coven, tell me, what exactly was Kumi doing in the Arctic? And he says, you know what, to be honest, I really don't know. But what I do know, he said, what I do know is that he must be deeply committed to it because he can't really swim to save his backside, right? And then when I was talking to some young people in my family, you know, kids and, you know, I've got a fresher perspective on the world, they were saying, you know what, Uncle Kumi, a better slogan would have been not save Arctic destruction, would have been simply to say, save Santa Claus now. Save Santa Claus now. And I said, and I thought about it, and I thought it was brilliant, because what they were saying is that don't project your consciousness on the people that you're trying to organize.
Right.
Humble yourself, understand where the consciousness of people are, and use the language image, because what association that ordinary people have with the Arctic?
The Arctic. Everybody knows Santa lives in the
Oh, everybody knows that Santa lives in the, no, it's fictional, all of that and so on, right? And then I tried discussing with some of my colleagues at Greenpeace and said,
they were like,
oh, no, we can't trivialize the issue, you know, we can't trivialize the issue. So that's the point I'm trying to make. I'm sorry I gave you such a long answer to that.
What blows my mind here is, and we'll come back to it because I know, Ben, you've got a second question, is just that I think I have this image that if you're the head of organizations like Greenpeace and Amnesty, you have the ability to bring about this change in direction or this change in tone. But yet, we're so entrenched in doing things a certain way that it feels like it's like even like, I don't know, I'm surprised by that reality.
Okay, I'm going to say my most controversial thing now.
Okay.
In response to that question, right? And I hope it's taken in the spirit that it's intended, right? 3 of you are based in London, right? Your team's based in London. The reality of London is not the reality of the world. The reality of Europe is not the reality of the world. The reality of North America is not the reality of the world, right? And, you know, when you say, how is it that you were not able to, you were the head of these 2 organizations and you weren't able to. So this is the difficulty. Why would anybody believe? This is what young people have been telling me, especially from Africa. And when I took the Amnesty position, some young people here were like very kind of questioning, right? They're saying, why do you think, Kumi, the solutions to the world's problems, you know, which is fossil fuel dependency, structural racism, an economic system that's unjust, nuclear weapons, all of these things came from the North, right? Came from the UK and Europe and so on. Why do you think solutions are going to come out of the very same places that created problems? So
it's a good question.
So it's a very good question, and it's a very painful question. And so, you know, the truth is, when you ask why was I not able to make those changes when I was at Greenpeace and Amnesty, for example, it's because, as is known, it's not a mystery what I'm going to say, that unfortunately, our international NGO institutions reflect all the inequalities and power differentials and so on that we see in the global world. So, for example, just plonking somebody like me, who comes from the global south at the top of these institutions doesn't solve the problems of structural racism that is alive and well and is not being contested sufficiently enough internally, right? So So yes, like when I was at Greenpeace, it was a completely open secret that you might be the head of Greenpeace International, but the most powerful persons are the head of the UK office, the German office, the US office, and so on, because they control the money, right? So there's a fair amount of messiness in civil society that for far too long we have been far too polite in terms of addressing it. And I must take a huge, I would say I tried hard to push these agendas on intersectionality, on bringing poverty and environment together, all of those things. And many people say, oh, I made a lot of progress. In my judgment, I made significantly less progress than when I went into those institutions to start with, because when I was being headhunted for the positions, the people who were headhunting me said, we really need you to help us deal with this question of the inequality of power, right, that exists between North and South within the organization. But, recognizing the problem at least is the first step, and I give credit to the people within those movements that did. But then having the courage to give up power, right, is very hard. And just to give you a very simple thing, like in the decision making at Greenpeace when I was there, all of Africa and China had one vote when we sat in our decision making, right? And Luxembourg had one vote, Belgium had one vote, France had one vote, every European country had one vote. So it was more who could raise more money, right, add more voice. And of course, these situations, like if you take Belgium or UK, they built the economic dominance historically by raping the wealth of the global South and through colonialism. So of course they're going to have more people there who can give donations on a monthly basis and so on, than you're going to find in places like Africa, where people are struggling to put food on the table. So I think the question, Maryam, I must honestly take my responsibility for not having been more effective in helping organizations that I've led to address systemic racism more forthrightly. I can say I tried, but trying is not good enough. Results is what matters. And I hope that in this current moment that we find ourselves, where the agenda of structural racism, economic inequality, and climate change have come together because the COVID dynamic reality has exposed, a range of these contradictions that exist. I hope that my colleagues who remain in these institutions and those that are in leadership will have much more courage to act with much greater urgency to address the inequalities and differentials of power that exist. And quite frankly, questions need to be asked of the organizations that have become brand names. They've been around for a long time, right? And they use up a lot of resources that are available for civil society. And if they're not able to deliver sufficient results in the current moment, then they must make way for others who can.
Yo, this was wild. That was so good.
I mean, exceeded my highest expectations. Kumi is out of this world. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. And you know what, Ben?
Yeah.
Because there's just so much here, we decided to make it a two-parter.
Right, that's a good there was way too much. There's so much
listeners,
stuff.
If you are feeling like you just want some more, good news.
Yeah.
Because we've got a part 2 coming for you shortly. In part 2, Kumi is going to be sharing more amazing stories, looking at the changing role of activism, and also he's going to talk to us about how different movements like Black Lives Matter and Extinction Rebellion can work together. So,
right, and that's so important.
And what else is going to happen, Ben, in that episode?
We're going to have some climate confessions. And this one, this is a good one, trust us.
So, we hope you tune in next time for all of these gems, and don't miss out.
Yeah, and remember, stay curious.
Thank you so much for joining us this week. We really hope you enjoyed this episode.
If you did, please rate, subscribe, and share this episode with a curious friend. It makes it possible to keep making this amazing content for you.
Oh, and slide into our DMs at TEDxLondon and let us know which climate extraordinaires you'd love to hear from next time. Oh, and don't leave yet. We wanted to tell you a bit more about who made this podcast possible.
Yeah, we did. TEDxLondon's headline partner, City, has been supporting us for the past 5 years to bring world-changing ideas to the TEDxLondon stage. And now they're taking it to the next level by making this podcast possible. Thanks, City.
But wait, that is not all.
No, this podcast was produced by the amazing Josie Colter.
Curation and research by the genius Tara Cooper.
Artwork designed by the visionaries that are Sabrina Russo and Rebecca Mingus.
Mixed and engineered by the iconic Ben Beheshty, aka The Falcon, who also composed our banging theme tune.
Presented by me, Maryam Pasha.
And by me, Ben Hurst. Stay curious.